The afternoon in Briar Hollow looked ordinary enough to lull you. Sunlight laid a warm stripe across Alder Street. Sprinklers ticked in tidy yards, and the old rental house at the corner with peeling blue trim sat quiet behind a tired chain-link fence. But ordinary died the second a little girl screamed from inside it. The sound sliced through birdsong and small talk, and every bystander felt it in their ribs before they understood it. Two neighbors halted mid-step with grocery bags hanging from their hands. A mail carrier stopped his cart like he'd hit an invisible wall. Curtains twitched. Somebody whispered, "Was that?" And nobody finished. Parked at the curb a few doors down, Deputy Mason Hale rested one forearm on the open window of his patrol unit, scanning traffic the way veterans do, without looking like they're scanning. While his K-9 partner, Rex, lay on the back seat with the quiet discipline of a dog who had learned that stillness could be a weapon. Rex's ears snapped forward before Mason's brain caught up, his whole frame going rigid as if a wire had been pulled tight. The scream came again, followed by a dull thud and a man's voice, too low to make out words, but sharp enough to carry threat. Rex didn't bark. He surged to his feet with a contained, professional fury that made the air in the car feel smaller. Mason's hand went instinctively to the latch on the K-9 gate. "Easy, buddy," he started, already pushing his door open, already running calculations of distance and risk and protocol. But the third sound, the smallest, was what tipped everything. A thin, choking gasp, as if the girl's voice had been swallowed. Rex hit the barrier once, twice, and the latch gave with a metallic snap Mason hadn't meant to allow. "Rex! Heel!" Mason barked, and the command carried the weight of years. But Rex was already a blur of tan and black, claws scraping asphalt, nose locked on an invisible trail that led straight to the rental house. People stepped back as if the dog wore electricity. A teenage boy raised a phone, then lowered it, unsure. Mason sprinted after Rex, boots pounding, radio bouncing at his shoulder. "Dispatch, possible child in distress, Alder and," he said, breath cutting, but his call was swallowed by the sudden crash of breaking glass. Rex launched, clean, committed, through the front window beside the door, shattering it outward in a sparkling spray. For a split second, the street became a still photograph. Neighbors wide-eyed, sunlight glittering on falling shards. Mason's outstretched hand too late, and the dark mouth of the house swallowing his dog. From inside came a strangled shout, then frantic footsteps. And somewhere inside, Rex's growl rose, steady, unforgiving, close now. Mason reached the window, weapon low, eyes high, heart hammering with one thought. Little girl's scream makes police dog break through window. And now, he would learn what happened inside. They thought it was just a scared kid, until they heard what the dog found. Briar Hollow liked to pretend it was the kind of town where nothing truly bad could happen, and on most afternoons, it almost convinced you. Porch swings creaked like metronomes, keeping time with slow conversation. The corner store's bell chimed whenever someone pushed through with a carton of milk or a bag of ice. And a light wind drifted down Alder Street, carrying the faint, clean smell of coming rain from the distant tree line. It was the sort of air that made you think of laundry drying on lines and dinner simmering. And it softened even the hard edges of the old rental house with its peeling blue trim. If you looked from the right angle, you could almost believe it was simply worn, not watched. Inside that house, Lila Carter moved like someone who had learned how to take up as little space as possible without losing herself. A small girl with bright eyes and a careful kind of dignity that didn't belong to her age. As if she'd been practicing bravery in private. She sat cross-legged at the kitchen table, pencil in hand, working on a worksheet while the radio played low. An old station that insisted on cheerful songs, even when the sky was turning slate. Her hair was pulled back with a simple clip, and every so often she paused to listen, not to the music, but to the house itself. The pipes, the settling wood, the subtle sounds that told you whether the world was safe. Across from her, Miss Evelyn Carter, her aunt, her caregiver, the only steady anchor Lila had left. Folded towels with deliberate calm, smoothing each edge like she could iron fear out of fabric. Evelyn's face carried the quiet fatigue of someone who'd been strong for too long. But her hands were gentle, and when she looked at Lila, her eyes softened with a protective tenderness that bordered on fierce. "You're doing good," she said, voice warm and low, the way you speak when you don't want the world to overhear your hope. Lila offered a small, polite smile, more courtesy than ease, and went back to writing, the pencil making tiny scratch sounds that felt comforting in the stillness. Outside, the neighborhood rolled on in its familiar rhythms. A dog barking 2 houses down, a lawnmower sputtering to a stop, the faint laughter of kids riding bikes past the corner store. On patrol, Deputy Mason Hale watched those rhythms like a man who'd seen how quickly they could break. Mason was the kind of veteran who didn't need to announce his competence. It sat in the way he parked with the front of his unit angled for a clean exit, in the way his eyes moved. Mirrors, porches, hands, doorways, without seeming nervous. His uniform fit like it belonged to him, but he didn't wear authority like a costume. He wore it like responsibility. In the back seat, Rex lay with his chin on his paws, steady and disciplined. A working dog who knew the difference between boredom and peace. Rex's gaze tracked movement through the tinted glass with a calm intensity, ears flicking at distant sounds. And when Mason reached back to tap the kennel grate, the dog's tail gave one slow thump. Loyalty, not excitement. Mason's radio murmured, but he kept his voice measured when he replied, a quiet presence moving through town like a promise that someone was paying attention. He passed the Carter rental house more than once that week, not because he'd been told to, but because his instincts had filed it away as a place that didn't quite fit the neighborhood's cozy story. The yard was too bare. The curtains stayed drawn even on bright days. And today, as a wind gust nudged the trees and the first cool hint of rain deepened the air, Mason noticed something small. So small most people would miss it. The front curtain twitched, quick as a blink, like someone had snapped it aside and then yanked it back. And a moment later, the door chain inside rattled once, metal against metal, as if a hand had tested it. Too fast, too nervous. Rex's head lifted a fraction. Mason's eyes narrowed, not in alarm yet, but in recognition of a pattern forming. The town still looked peaceful, still sounded normal, still smelled like rain. But one detail was off, and in Mason Hale's world, off was how bad things started. The next day, the rain held off like it was listening, leaving the air damp and heavy. And Briar Hollow went about its routines with the easy confidence of people who thought familiarity was the same as safety. Evelyn walked Lila down to the corner store for bread and a few cans, keeping the girl close at her side, one hand resting lightly on Lila's shoulder, as if touch alone could ward off whatever shadows had been gathering around their life. Lila wore a simple hoodie and carried a small list on folded paper, her gaze polite and lowered. But her attention was sharp. She noticed every car that slowed, every door that opened, every voice that rose. The store bell chimed when they entered, and for a minute the world felt normal. Fluorescent lights, the smell of coffee, the soft hum of a cooler. Then the front door banged open again, and in walked Darrell Boone, the kind of man everyone in town knew without really knowing. Broad smile, shiny boots, loud voice that filled space like smoke. He wasn't officially anything, but he acted like he was the unofficial answer to problems. The guy who, handled things for people with money and influence. Darryl leaned on the counter like he owned it, nodded at the clerk, then turned that grin on Evelyn and Lila as if he'd been waiting for them. "Well, look at this," he said, drawing the words out for an audience. "Miss Evelyn, right? And this must be little Lila. How's my favorite tenants doing?" The way he said tenants made it sound less like a legal word and more like a leash. Evelyn's spine stiffened, but her face stayed composed. "We're just shopping," she said, measured, trying to end it before it became something. Darryl chuckled. Too friendly, then pulled a manila envelope from under his arm and tapped it against the counter. "Shopping's fine," he said, "but you can't shop your way out of late fees." He flipped the envelope open with theatrical care and slid out papers that looked official enough to intimidate, though the inked numbers on them made no sense at a glance. "See, here's the thing," he continued, pitching his voice higher so the two customers near the chips aisle could hear, so the guy by the coffee station could glance over. "Your rent's been irregular, and there's some paperwork that got missed. Real shame. We're trying to be understanding." Evelyn took a breath, slow, steady. "We paid on time," she said. "Every month. I have receipts." Darryl's smile didn't change, but something behind it sharpened. "Receipts," he repeated, like the word amused him. "Sure you do. But the ledger doesn't match. And when the ledger doesn't match, that means penalties." He pointed to a line item with a thick finger. "Late fees, processing fees, compliance fees. It adds up. Funny how it adds up." Lila's fingers tightened around her shopping list, the paper crinkling softly. She looked up once, just once, and saw that the other adults weren't stepping in. They were watching, pretending not to watch. A woman in a denim jacket turned her cart slightly, blocking her own view as if that could protect her from being involved. The clerk's eyes darted between Darryl and Evelyn, then dropped to the register, hands suddenly busy with nothing. Fear in Briar Hollow didn't always look like screaming. Sometimes it looked like silence, like people choosing the safe side of the room. Evelyn kept her voice even. "We're not behind," she said again. "If there's an error, we can sort it out through the proper channels." Darryl laughed, but it was a short, sharp sound. "Proper channels," he echoed, and now the performance was fully for the room. "Listen, ma'am, I'm the channel. I'm trying to help you before this turns into something official." He leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough that the words felt private, even though everyone could still sense them. "You don't want code enforcement sniffing around," he murmured. "You don't want a lock change. You don't want your little situation becoming the talk of town." Evelyn's cheeks flushed, not with guilt but with contained anger, and still she didn't raise her voice. "Please step back," she said, placing her body subtly between Darryl and Lila. Darryl's grin widened at that, like he enjoyed the attempt at protection. He tilted his head, eyes flicking to Lila, then back to Evelyn. "Aw," he said, mock sympathetic. "I admire the fight. But here's the truth. Folks who make noise around here, they tend to regret it." He leaned in one last inch, close enough that Evelyn could smell his aftershave and something sour underneath. And he spoke softly, the words slipping into her ear like a threat wrapped in advice. "You don't want trouble in this town." Then he straightened, smile bright again, as if he'd just offered a friendly reminder, and the room stayed silent, because everyone heard him, and everyone knew what he meant. Mason Hale rolled up to the corner store on what looked like the most ordinary call of the day. No sirens, no urgency in his posture, just the steady rhythm of routine patrol, because routine was where you caught the things other people missed. and because his instincts had been tugging him back toward Alder Street like a magnet ever since that curtain twitch. He parked at an angle that gave him a clean view of the door and a clean exit if he needed it, then stepped out into air that smelled like wet pavement and brewing coffee, nodding once at a passing neighbor without breaking stride. Rex stayed inside for a beat, watching through the back window with quiet focus, ears swiveling, body relaxed but ready. And Mason's hand brushed the K9 release as naturally as breathing. The store bell chimed when Mason entered, and the first thing he felt wasn't sound or sight. It was tension, thick as humidity, pooling around the counter where Evelyn stood stiff-backed with Lila tucked close. And Darrell Boone leaned in, with his bright grin and his papers like props in a cheap play. Mason didn't know Darrell personally, but he knew the type. Loud confidence, friendly face, hands that stayed busy so your eyes wouldn't look too hard at them. And he knew something else just as quickly. The little girl's fear wasn't the normal shy discomfort of a kid around grown-up conflict. It was the tight, watchful fear of someone who had been cornered before. Someone measuring escape routes in a room full of adults pretending not to see. Lila's fingers were clenched around her list so hard the papers shook. And her breathing had that shallow, controlled pattern Mason had heard from victims and witnesses who didn't want to cry because crying made predators happy. Mason slowed, letting his presence arrive before his words did, and he positioned himself without drama. 1 step, 2 steps, until he stood between Darrell and the child like a door closing. "Afternoon," Mason said, voice calm, almost casual, the way you speak when you want to lower the temperature without surrendering the room. Darrell's grin flickered, then returned bigger, performative. "Deputy Hale," he said, as if they were old friends. "Just handling a little paperwork situation. No big deal." Mason didn't take the bait, didn't match the volume. He let his eyes track hands first, Darrell's right hand gripping the manila envelope, left hand resting too comfortably near Evelyn's receipts. Then he took in exits. Front door behind him, aisle gap to the side, the clerk's line in sight, the corner of the store where mirrors reflected movement. "Ma'am," Mason said to Evelyn, not taking his eyes fully off Darrell, "are you being prevented from leaving?" The question was precise, procedural, simple enough for a clear answer, serious enough to signal consequences. Evelyn's throat bobbed as she swallowed. "No," she said carefully. "But he's saying we owe fees that don't make sense." Mason nodded once, as if filing it. "Sir," he said to Darrell, "what's your role here?" Darrell spread his hands a fraction, smile fixed. "Just a representative," he said, "helping the property owner, keeping things smooth." Mason's gaze dipped to the papers. "Then you won't mind stepping back and giving them space," he replied, still calm. "If there's a civil issue, you can handle it through the courts, not over a counter with a child present." The room seemed to exhale without realizing it. Darrell's eyes sharpened. "Deputy, come on," he said with a chuckle that didn't reach his face. "We're neighbors. We're all just trying to keep the town running." Mason tilted his head slightly, the smallest gesture that carried a warning. "We keep it running by following the law," he answered, and there was steel under the softness now. Behind Mason, Rex let out a sound from the patrol unit. Low, controlled, a rumble that wasn't a bark, but carried the unmistakable message of a trained dog reading the same room. The rumble made heads turn. It made Darrell's eyes dart toward the window, calculating. Mason didn't move, didn't crowd him. He simply held the line with his body and his calm. "Step back," Mason repeated, quieter this time, which somehow made it heavier. Darrell's smile stayed, but his jaw tightened. For a moment it looked like he might push it, like he might try to make a scene, but Rex's rumble deepened just a notch. And Daryl decided he didn't want that kind of attention. He lifted the envelope, tapping it once as if to say he'd be back for it later, and took a step away. "Fine," he said lightly. "No problem? I'll let the proper channels do their thing." He backed toward the door, still smiling, still playing friendly for the watchers. But when he reached the threshold, he let his eyes lock onto Mason's, cold now, stripped of charm, and the look said everything his polite words didn't. "This isn't over." Then the bell chimed again as he left, and the store felt warmer by a few degrees, even though the air outside had turned darker with rain. By the time Mason got back to the station, the rain had finally decided to commit, tapping the roof in steady little strikes that sounded like impatience, and the fluorescent lights inside the bullpen made everyone look a shade more tired than they already were. Mason clipped Rex's leash to the kennel ring, gave the dog a brief, grounding touch at the collar. One of those silent exchanges that said stay sharp without saying it, and then headed straight for Captain Roy Kessler's office with the same calm purpose he used on patrol. Kessler was a Briar Hollow fixture, the kind of man who'd shake your hand at the diner and call you son, no matter your age. And his office reflected that folksy veneer. Hunting photos on the wall, a coffee mug that read, "World's Best Boss," and a desk that always looked just messy enough to seem busy. He glanced up as Mason knocked once and stepped in. "Hail," Kessler said, friendly as ever. "If this is about overtime, I already told the council—" "It's not overtime," Mason cut in, measured, placing his report pad on the edge of the desk without slamming it. "I had an interaction at Marley's corner store. Daryl Boone was pressuring a tenant, Evelyn Carter, about fees and paperwork. He was doing it in public, with a child present. The girl showed signs of real fear. Not normal." Kessler leaned back, lacing his fingers over his stomach, smile tugging like this was all a bit of harmless small-town drama. "Daryl," he said, chuckling softly. "That boy's got a big mouth, sure, but he's not a criminal mastermind." Mason didn't smile. "I didn't say mastermind," he replied. "I said intimidation. It looked like coercion. I asked if she was being prevented from leaving. He was crowding her. He made a veiled threat. And I've noticed odd activity around that rental house. Curtain movements, door chain rattling. Something's not right." Kessler's expression shifted into the familiar minimizing mask Mason had learned to distrust, the one that smoothed rough edges so nobody had to deal with them. "Probably a misunderstanding," Kessler said, waving a hand as if brushing crumbs off a table. "Landlord disputes get heated. Folks get embarrassed. They hear a stern tone and call it a threat. You know how it is." Mason held his ground. "Captain, the child—" "Hail," Kessler interrupted, voice still warm but firmer now. "Don't stir things up over rent squabbles. We've got real calls, domestic disturbances, drunk drivers. Daryl's tied up with property owners who pay half the taxes in this town. That landlord's connected. You start poking around and the council's going to be in my office by morning, asking why my deputies are harassing community partners." The way he said community partners made Mason's stomach tighten. "So we do nothing?" Mason asked, still quiet. But the question landed like a weight. Kessler sighed like Mason was being difficult. "We keep an eye out," he said, the classic answer that meant don't write it down. "We don't go looking for trouble. If something criminal happens, we respond. Until then, let civil matters stay civil." Mason nodded once, not agreeing, documenting the refusal in his head, and slid his report pad back into his hand. "Understood," he said. And he meant only that. He understood exactly what kind of wall he'd just hit. Outside the office, the station noise resumed. Phones, radios, laughter too loud, and Mason walked past it with his face composed and his thoughts sharp. Because if the official channel was clogged with politics, he would build his own record. He returned to his cruiser, checked his body cam battery, and began logging quietly, the way experienced men do when they realize truth may need protection. Date, time, location, names, behaviors, descriptions of papers waved like weapons. He wrote down the make and model of Daryl's truck from memory, then went out on patrol and confirmed the plate, repeating it under his breath so it stuck, letting the rain wash the windshield while his eyes worked. He didn't tail Daryl, too obvious, but he noted where the truck parked, who climbed in, who climbed out, and the small tell of men who think they own a town, the way they never looked over their shoulder. Each time Mason spoke into his mic, his body cam audio captured more than dispatch chatter. It caught the edges of other voices on the street, passing comments, local names dropped like casual stones. And then, near sundown, as Mason sat idling across from the blue trim rental house and watched a shadow shift behind the curtains too quickly again, his body cam picked up Daryl's voice drifting from the porch 2 doors down, low but clear enough on recording. "Don't worry," Daryl murmured to someone Mason couldn't see. "Mr. Whitlock wants this handled clean." Mason's hand stilled on the steering wheel, because Whitlock was not just another local name. Whitlock was important. The kind of important that shouldn't be anywhere near a frightened little girl and an unpaid fees envelope. And in the soft click of his body cam saving the audio, Mason felt the first domino wobble. The rain had quit an hour earlier, leaving Alder Street slick under a bruised dusk when Evelyn and Lila returned to the blue trim rental with a paper bag of groceries and the careful quiet of people who knew they were being watched. Mason sat half a block away in his cruiser, eyes on the porch, because keep an eye out was what the captain said when he wanted you blind, and Mason refused. Evelyn fumbled her key and Lila stayed close, chin tucked, as if the air might grab her. Daryl Boone appeared from the side of the house like he'd been waiting, smiling wide, waving a folder. "Evening, ladies," he called, loud enough for porches to hear, and 2 faces vanished behind curtains. Evelyn lifted the grocery bag like a shield. "We're done talking," she said. Daryl's grin tightened. "Not done until the ledger says we're done. Owner's tired of excuses." He stepped closer, angling his body to block the steps, and Mason saw Lila's eyes dart to the street, to the locked calm of houses that suddenly felt far. Mason opened his door, radio in hand, voice even. "Dispatch, unit on. Alder. Possible disturbance." Evelyn tried to pivot around Daryl, and Daryl's hand shot out, quick, controlling, grabbing Lila's hoodie sleeve. "Hold up," he snapped. Lila jerked back, and Daryl, annoyed, yanked once, hard enough to pull her off balance. Evelyn's gasp cut the air. "Don't touch her," she shouted. Daryl's smile dropped. "Then pay what you owe," he hissed. He shoved the front door with his shoulder, and when Evelyn tried to block it, he crowded her, forcing space with his weight. The door swung inward. The chain rattled. A second voice inside murmured something fast. Then Daryl hooked Lila by the sleeve and dragged her across the threshold. "Lila!" Evelyn cried, lunging. But the door slammed in her face, and the chain snapped into place with metallic finality. Voices rose inside. Daryl's low and angry, the other man's urgent. Then a dull thud against wood. Evelyn pounded the door, pleading. Mason broke into a run. In the back seat, Rex rose, ears forward, body coiled, reading panic like scent. Then it happened. A scream, raw and thin, Not a tantrum. Pure fear that cut through the wet air and made the block freeze. Rex locked onto it like a targeting beam. Mason's hand hit the latch. "Rex, heel!" he barked. But the dog launched before the command could land, a blur of muscle and loyalty. He hit the window beside the door in a single strike, glass bursting outward in bright shards under the porch light. Mason skidded to the steps, weapon low, eyes high, listening. Rex's growl rolled through the broken frame, steady and professional, not rage. Mason heard hurried footsteps, a chair scraping, and someone whispering a name that didn't belong here, Whitlock. Like a prayer and a warning tonight. For half a second there was only ringing silence. Then, from inside, muffled but unmistakable, a voice spat the words, "Don't let her talk." Mason vaulted through the shattered window frame, glass crunching under his boots, and the porch light threw jagged reflections across the living room like broken stars. The air inside was wrong. Stale chemicals riding over damp rot, as if someone had tried to erase a scene with cleaner and only made it louder. The vents along the baseboards were covered with cheap plastic and tape, puffed outward like they'd been forced to breathe through a gag, and a box fan sat unplugged in the corner, positioned like a prop that had been abandoned mid-act. A mop bucket stood in the hallway with gray water and a rag soaked through, and the floorboards near the kitchen shone wet in streaks that didn't match any natural spill pattern. Hurried cleanup. The kind you do when you're trying to beat a clock you can hear ticking. Rex was already inside, but he wasn't tearing the room apart. He moved with trained precision, nose low, shoulders tight, tail held steady, giving Mason space while still owning the center line. A low, controlled growl rolled from his chest, and when a figure shifted behind the couch, Rex snapped into a block, body angled, teeth bared but not lunging, an alert that said, "I see you. Don't move." "Hands," Mason ordered, voice sharp now, weapon still low but ready, and a man in a stained work jacket froze with palms up, eyes wide. The kind of panic that wasn't innocence so much as fear of being caught. Mason's gaze cut past him down the hall, where a door at the back sat shut with a new padlock screwed into the frame. Too new, too shiny. The metal plate still bright against old wood. The lock wasn't meant to keep someone out. It was meant to keep someone in. Rex didn't rush the man. He pinned him with presence, stepping laterally to corner him against the wall, and Mason moved past, sweeping the hall with quick, practiced checks. A closet door cracked open, empty shelves, a folded tarp leaning like it had been moved recently. Near the kitchen counter, a smartphone lay face up, screen glowing, its camera app open with a red dot pulsing, recording mid-capture, and the angle suggested it had been shoved down in a hurry, still trying to witness from the shadows. Mason snatched it, eyes flicking to the live feed, a shaky view of a backroom doorway and a child's small hands. "Lila," he called, softer for one breath, and Rex's ears snapped toward the padlocked door as if the name were a beacon. Mason tested the knob, solid, held, then dropped his shoulder into it once, twice, wood splintering around the screws until the lock ripped free with a harsh crack. Inside, the room was colder, the air thick with that same chemical sting, and Lila was there, curled behind a stacked storage bin, knees hugged tight, eyes huge, shaking so hard her teeth clicked. She was alive, but trapped, and the sight of Mason made her inhale like she'd been underwater. "You're safe," he said, crouching, palm open, keeping his body between her and the hall. Rex slid in beside them, not crowding, just anchoring, his head low and watchful, a living shield. Lila's gaze darted to Mason's hand holding the phone, and she whispered, barely audible, "Auntie," like the word itself hurt. Mason swallowed, mind racing through what the recording might have caught, through the name Whitlock like a shard under skin. And he reached back to guide Lila toward the doorway. Then the whole house shuddered with sound. Footsteps thundered from deeper inside, heavy and fast. And beneath them, another set answered. More than one closing in. While Rex's growl shifted into something darker that said the danger hadn't left. It was coming. He keyed his radio. No chatter, no reply, just hiss. Then raised his voice into the house anyway. "Deputy Hale, step out where I can see you." Rex's growl deepened, not louder, but closer to a warning line. Meanwhile, while sirens still hadn't reached Alder Street and the night held its breath, Darrell Boone sat in a private office above the town's quiet bank. The kind of upstairs suite people walked past for years without ever looking up, because the windows were tinted and the people who entered never came in through the front. The carpet was thick, the lights were warm, and the framed photos on the wall showed ribbon cuttings and handshakes. Progress, charity, civic pride. Always with the same polished man near the center, smiling like he belonged everywhere. Conrad Whitlock listened from behind a broad desk with no clutter, no family photos, nothing soft. He wore calm the way other men wore armor, and his voice never rose, which somehow made him more frightening than Darrell's bluster. Darrell tried to talk fast, to outrun the truth with words. "It was smooth until the deputy showed," he said, rubbing his palms on his jeans. "Hale, K9 unit. He stepped in, asked questions, made it look like I was the bad guy, and then Darrell swallowed. The dog busted a window, got inside." Whitlock's eyes didn't widen, didn't flicker. He simply folded his hands and asked gently, "Did the child speak to him?" Darrell hesitated, and that hesitation was an answer. Whitlock exhaled like a man disappointed by minor inconvenience. "Darrell," he said, still reasonable, "we agreed this pipeline works because it stays quiet. Notices go out, fees appear, people panic, they sign, they leave. Complaints vanish in the right inbox. Records get corrected. That is the entire machine." He said machine like it was a civic service. Darrell nodded quickly, eager. I know, it's just... She had receipts and the aunt's got a backbone and the kid..." He stopped himself, but Whitlock's gaze sharpened on the word kid. "The kid is the leverage," Whitlock said, tone almost instructional. "Fear is efficient. Fear keeps neighbors looking away. Fear keeps clerks from remembering. Fear keeps reports from being filed." He tapped a folder on his desk, and Darrell saw what was inside without seeing it. Forged notices, altered ledgers, copies of complaints stamped, received, and then rerouted into nothing. A chain of signatures that made wrongdoing look like policy. "This isn't one rental," Whitlock continued. "It's a pattern. It's control. And control collapses if one honest deputy decides to become a hero." Darrell forced a laugh. "He's just a deputy," he said. Whitlock's smile arrived, small and precise. "A deputy with a body cam," he replied. "A deputy with a dog trained to find what people hide." He leaned forward a fraction, and the room seemed to tighten around Darrell's lungs. "Containment," Whitlock said, as if reading from a checklist. "First, smear him. Make him look reckless. An unstable K9 handler who endangers the public. Second, scare witnesses. Remind the neighbors why they keep curtains closed. Third, recover whatever evidence exists. Phones, recordings, anything the child captured." Darrell's mouth went dry. "What if the recording's already out?" he asked. Whitlock's voice stayed soft. "Then we move faster," he said. "We make sure the right people hear our version first." He stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the town lights like they belonged to him. When he spoke again, it was almost a whisper. but it landed like a verdict. "If that dog got in," Whitlock said, quiet as a closing door, "then we have a problem." By morning, Briar Hollow had already started rewriting the night like it was a story nobody wanted to own. Evelyn and Lila sat under a thin blanket in the station's interview room, hands wrapped around paper cups that had long gone cold, while Mason stood outside the glass, jaw tight, watching the way fear made people shrink even when they were safe. The official version traveled faster than truth. Misunderstanding, civil dispute, overreaction. Captain Kessler pulled Mason aside before the sun fully cleared the clouds, his voice soft with that same folksy caution that always meant pressure from somewhere higher. "Hale, you made a mess," Kessler said. Not angry, worried. "Window busted, dog unleashed, civilian property damage. Council's already buzzing. Whitlock's office called." Mason's eyes narrowed. "Whitlock's office?" he repeated. Kessler lifted both hands like he was calming a storm. "You did your job," he said quickly, "but you need to stand down now. Let it cool. Let legal sort it out." Mason's calm hardened into something colder. "A child was locked in a room," he said. "There was a phone recording. There were covered vents and chemical smell. That's not cool-off territory." Kessler's gaze slid away, and that was all Mason needed to confirm the rot. Out in the neighborhood, the pressure tightened like a noose. Evelyn's phone rang from an unknown number, and when she answered, a man's voice spoke gently about moving on and not making a spectacle. Then listed Lila's school bus stop and the time it arrived. At the corner store, the clerk who'd watched Darryl bully them suddenly insisted she couldn't remember any of it. "I was busy," she said, eyes fixed on the floor, hands trembling as she scanned canned goods that didn't need scanning. Two neighbors who'd been outside during the window crash told Mason they'd heard a bang, but didn't see who did what. Their faces pinched with shame and fear, as if admitting truth would cost them more than lying. A work truck idled across from the Carter rental for an hour, then left without doing anything, like a message delivered without words. Even Rex felt it. He paced in short, controlled loops at the kennel, ears pricked, reading the station's tension the way he read scent on wind. Mason kept his voice measured, his posture steady, but he began to document like a man preparing for war. He backed up his body cam footage, he photographed the window damage and the lock hardware. He cataloged the phone's recording file, and he wrote down every instance of intimidation, every unexplained truck, every forgotten witness. Still, he could feel the walls closing, not from the street but from inside the institution. Paperwork delays, evidence misfiled, a quiet hint from a senior deputy that Mason was being talked about in rooms he wasn't in. That afternoon, as rain returned in a thin, relentless drizzle, a junior records clerk named Jenna Park hovered near Mason's desk like she was fighting herself. She was young, precise. The kind of employee who always followed rules because rules felt safer than people. Mason noticed her trembling hands before he noticed her face. "Deputy," she whispered, barely moving her lips. "Can I talk to you off the record?" Mason didn't answer with words. He stood, nodded once, and led her to the supply room, where the hum of the vending machine masked voices. Jenna swallowed hard. "They told me not to," she said. "Captain said it's above our pay grade, but I've been seeing things." Mason's eyes stayed gentle but locked. "What things?" Jenna reached into her tote bag and pulled out a small portable drive wrapped in a folded receipt like she'd smuggled contraband. "Complaint logs," she breathed. "Digital copies. Reports that came in about Whitlock properties, mold, illegal fees, threats, People saying they were pressured to leave. They get stamped and then they disappear. Someone's been altering the database. But the backup server keeps a shadow trail and I copied it before they wiped it. Her voice cracked. There's also a duplicate keys log from maintenance, units accessed when tenants weren't home, and transfers, payments to a consulting account that ties back to Daryl Boone. Mason took the drive carefully, like it was fragile and explosive at the same time. "Jenna," he said, quiet. "Do you understand what this is?" Tears shone in her eyes. "It's proof," she whispered, "and I'm tired of pretending I don't see." Mason's pulse stayed steady, but his mind moved fast. Internal channels were compromised, local authority was compromised, and the name Whitlock was now tied to a pattern, not a suspicion. He looked at the drive in his palm, then at Jenna's terrified face, and he made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff with a rope you trust. He walked straight to his cruiser, shut the door, and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. An old contact from a joint task force, a state-level investigator who owed him one honest favor. When the line picked up, Mason didn't waste breath. "I need you to listen," he said, voice flat with urgency. "This can't stay local." He glanced in the rearview mirror at the station lights, at the town that wanted to bury its own secrets, and he added, low and certain, "I've got evidence. And a child witness. I need higher authority, today." The pause on the other end was short, and then a voice answered with the weight Mason had been waiting for. "Send what you have. We're coming." 2 days later, Briar Hollow woke to a different kind of quiet, the kind that comes before a storm breaks. And this time it wasn't weather rolling in. It was authority. Unmarked SUVs slid onto Alder Street at dawn, tires whispering on damp pavement. And investigators in plain jackets stepped out with the calm posture of people who don't threaten, they proceed. Radios clicked, folders opened, and warrants were read in level voices that didn't care about local reputations. Marin Sloan, the state lead, met Mason at the station gate, scanned his bruised window frame cuts, then nodded once as if to say, "You did the right thing. Now let us finish it." She took the copied drive from Jenna's hands, logged it, sealed it, and sent a team to image every computer that touched the complaint database. Another team drove straight to Daryl Boone's house, knocked once, and when he opened the door with that familiar grin, they turned the grin into silence with a warrant and a pair of cuffs. Daryl tried to laugh, then tried to bargain, then tried to blame. But the procedure didn't blink, and he was in the back of an SUV before the neighbors could decide whether to watch or hide. Then the dominoes reached inward. Captain Kessler was called into an interview room, offered a recorder, and asked why he told a deputy to stand down after a child was locked behind a new lock. His folksy smile cracked. His answers tangled. And when the investigators played Mason's body cam audio with the name Whitlock drifting through it, Kessler's face went gray. By noon, a warrant hit the bank's upstairs offices, and Conrad Whitlock's polished calm finally met something it couldn't buy. Agents at his door, quiet, relentless, already knowing the ledgers were forged and the transfers were real. Files were seized, phones were cloned, and the pipeline Whitlock built on intimidation collapsed under the weight of its own paperwork. Evelyn held Lila close as the town exhaled. Some avoided her eyes, some brought food and apologies, and a few cried on porches, ashamed of their silence. No one pretended forgiveness was instant, but doors started opening again, curtains stayed parted longer, and people began saying the truth out loud, even if their voices shook. That evening, after Lila gave her statement and a victim advocate led her to a safe place, Mason walked Rex into the station yard, where mist clung to the grass like breath. He knelt, rested a steady hand on Rex's collar, and the dog leaned in. Work done, loyalty intact, eyes still scanning because protection is a habit, not a moment. Mason's voice was low, meant for Rex and maybe for the town listening through new courage. Good job, partner. You heard her when nobody else did. And somewhere, beyond the streetlights, the last echo of that scream still hung in the air as a warning and a promise. It saved her, but it also exposed a secret the town spent years hiding.